major sets of questions. The first is, what is the place and function of a military dimension of EU crisis management? What is there in this particular area? The impact of the Lisbon Treaty, beyond, in a way, what has been said, and which are currently the major strands of development. Allow me to start with, to make some more general remarks about EU crisis management from the perspective of a military working in the intergovernmental frame as the EU military community. So first remark is that CSFP and CSDP and the crisis management areas linked to them are by far, in the reality, particularly of the External Action Service, of a civilian nature. You have seen the organigram and you have seen the weight of the relative weight of the military and the relative weight of the civilian aspects. So the EAS, External Action Service, is essentially structured for civilian aspects of crisis management. And here I mean crisis management in its broader sense. It's not particularly on a given crisis, but all the aspects which can be put around a crisis. The proportion of military personnel, therefore, in the EU institutions is very small. Sometimes there comes comparison with NATO. That has nothing to do, even in the context of the External Action Service. So the normal figure of personnel working in Brussels is 1,600, and of this 1,600, 200 are military. But that's only a very small proportion of the civilian personnel working in the broader sense of crisis management. You have heard about this afternoon already how it came to the External Action Service. So to a very large extent, it was a mix, a blend of elements of the Commission, formally, and elements of the Council Secretariat. Particularly the elements coming from the Commission have no experience in working with military, because the work of the Commission is in no way of a military nature. That's one of the particular challenges we have to meet as a military working inside the External Action Service. And each external action of the EU, and in a very large way, encompassing actions triggered by the External Action Service, so intergovernmentally, but also by the Commission in its different strands, cover a very large toolbox and of instruments to address crisis and stability-related situations. Again, only a small proportion of that is really military. To give you an idea what the military proper can add as a value to crisis management in the EU context, I would like to give you some examples of that. Provide expertise, specific military expertise and intelligence. Provide support to humanitarian actions, particularly in what we in our jargon call the C2 structures, command and control. Provide short-term focused intelligence to prepare specific actions. So to tell the External Action Service what is really the situation in a country, in an area, what do we have to expect. Provide initial entry forces into an intended area of mission or operations. As soon as we're there, provide a safe and secure environment. Typical example for a safe and secure environment on the EU side was the operation in Chad. It's still ongoing, the operation Althea in Bosnia and Herzegovina. On the NATO side, it's KFOR. Support civilian actors with specific capabilities, particularly logistics. Train military forces. Give you an example of EUTM Somalia. I'll come back to that. Provide specific skills for post-conflict management. Again, SSR, one example for that, border management. There are military strands to border management. So that's a military skill which can be brought into the broader EU crisis management picture. And there are actions which do not fit exactly in what I have said earlier, for instance, combating piracy. That's a military action of a specific nature, but it is clearly military. Some words about crisis management in more general terms. Crisis management in the narrower sense is about one crisis, about one situation. But in the larger sense, it encompasses long-term situation awareness. That's why the Joint Situation Center is so interesting and important. Awareness and analysis, development cooperation, that very much lies with the Commission, conflict prevention, assistance in case of humanitarian disasters, and so on. So a very broad spectrum. Impact of the Lisbon Treaty. We have already seen the European Action Service. For us, as a military, we have in the EAS all the tools represented we need for strategic planning and for strategic information input. In particular, we have, and these were all the yellow-orange elements, general directorates, you had on the bottom of the slide, which are regional and functional. And we have in parallel, as an overlay, which was not shown on the slide because it's very difficult and complicated to sketch it out, it's the crisis management procedures. And Dr. Duke mentioned the last council conclusions. That has to be improved, because to bring all these dots together and to draw the right lines, some of them are only dotted lines, others are full lines, that's still very complicated. And at the same time, it is an essential question for readiness and rapid reaction for crisis management, EU's crisis management. The function of the High Representative has, as already mentioned, a very large agenda, Vice President of the Commission, which brings also knowledge and experience from the Commission into the External Action Service. At least that double function has the potential to do so. She is also the head of the agency, of the mentioned European Defence Agency. And she is also the president of the Foreign Affairs Council. So that's very much. One person cannot deal with that, so you need excellent staff work to deal with it. And that's still work in progress, very difficult work in progress. I'm sure that Mr. Cooper will be able to tell you more about that, because he's directly involved with that. He's on the right level, exactly underneath the High Representative. For the military in particular, the EUMS, the EU military staff, thank you for that, that's very kind, is, so, very top right, EU military staff. What does it do? It's to contribute to European capability development, so we are back with the context to the European Defence Agency. Elaborate general concepts for military CSDP operations, situational awareness and early warning from a military perspective. That's why we have an intelligence directorate with, for the time being, an Austrian general as head of that directorate. And contribution to CSDP crisis management planning on a strategic, military strategic level. And this is completed on the strategic level by the also mentioned CMPD, Crisis Management Planning Directorate, which is also part of the External Action Service. And in reality, we need a triangle with the civilian part, and that's the CPCC, which was mentioned, for civilian operations and missions. You mentioned permanent structured cooperation as a potential for enhanced capability building. I have to admit, for the time being, we do not see very much of it. I would rather talk about a stalemate in this area. The barrier is of a political nature, and again, from a military perspective, it realized in terms of inclusiveness. Either you can build it in a way which is very inclusive but not very effective, or vice versa. And you can imagine the member states on the one and on the other side of the spectrum. What we have, in a way, legally on a completely different ground, but in a way to replace the function on the basis of the given array of consensus, is pooling and sharing. So it's the so-called Ghent initiative from a informal ministers' meeting about 1.5 years ago. And I will come back to that. It's an idea of a completely different nature, and it's on an entirely voluntary basis. That's the big difference with all the weaknesses of voluntariness. Mutual assistance clause and solidarity clause, which are of completely different instruments. Mutual assistance clause is not being discussed currently. Solidarity clause, there is a faint echo of discussions, particularly as far as it comes to the military aspects of it. There are military aspects which are of a subsidiary nature. So the military are not players in the first row for solidarity clause, but in the way of assistance operations, they could be called on. And to conclude on the first part about the impact of the Lisbon Treaty, from my personal observation, and I think that was already clearly set out in the earlier statements, particularly the loss of the role of the rotating presidency led to a situation where, in particular, smaller member states have more difficulties to make their voice heard in that context. I'll give you one example. You mentioned it. These council conclusions about the most recent ones from 1st of December, last week, about CSDP, and the particular part about the Weimar Triangle and the particular aspect of the Weimar Triangle, which is permanent conduct and planning capability. These discussions, all the time, from the informal ministers' meeting in Krakow to the Council, were led in a format 5+1. And in the end, 2+1. So, to make it clearer, 5 is the 3 countries of the Weimar Triangle, France, Germany and Poland, plus Italy, plus Spain on the one side. You can imagine who was on the other side, the UK. And then it was narrowed down to 2+1, Germany, France and the UK. So where are 4 member states in that? So that's one of the difficulties, and one reason for that is also the gradual loss of weight of the rotating presidency by the provisions of the Lisbon Treaty. I mentioned the Weimar Triangle, I mentioned planning and conduct. Still, as a thorough European, I was a bit disappointed by the outcome. But I have to be cautious how to express that. So we have a sufficient basis to carry on, as mentioned in these conclusions, in improving our crisis management procedures. That's the most difficult part. Have we really won something new? I'm not sure about it. We have now the right to activate the op center. We had the right already before. We have the right to activate the op center for 2 or 3 small-scale operations. that is new for these operations, but not in the general picture. So very much has to be clarified about that. How shall it work? Does it mean a permanent activation of the op center? What is the impact of such an activation of the working capability of the EU military staff? Many questions to be asked in the military committee. What counts for the military? And that's very important. To be involved in the entire external action-related thinking of the EAS from the very first moment. When the EAS considers a situation which is not a crisis, necessarily a crisis, the military should be involved, not with the intended outcome of a military operation, but with the intended outcome to have a complete picture. What can be a possible military input to EU action in the Sahel area, for instance, or in South Sudan? In many cases, in a large majority of cases, this will be turned out as no role for the military or an advisory role for the military. But you can only play even that advisory role if you are involved from the very first moment. And that's a request we have, and which we advocate regularly. Second strand of developments is operations. I know you will have a panel tomorrow dealing with operations. Just 3 examples. We have currently 2 ongoing military operations in the narrowest sense of the term. It's Althea in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Atalanta at the Horn of Africa, off the coast of Somalia. And I will start with Atalanta. It is not known enough that Atalanta yields a double success. This year we have a real impact on pirates' activity. There is a very considerable decrease in successful attacks. And on the other side, there is a change of attitude in commercial shipping. Commercial shipping companies change their behavior. They are more cautious. They prepare their ships in a different way. They make the operation headquarters aware of their passage through that area. So these are important points which also help very much. Of course, Atalanta is not a standalone operation. It has to be seen in the larger context of the Horn of Africa strategy, and I will come back to that. Operation Althea is in a very difficult situation for the time being, because we have a task which is much larger than the available military forces. We have to deal with that. The most likely way of dealing with that is to use reserves, or we call it in the jargon, over-the-horizon reserves. Battle groups could be one example for that, but also other types of multinational forces created particularly for this purpose. Libya. Libya, in fact, existed only in the form of an operational headquarters and was never activated as a fully fledged operation. The military planning effort, you remember, of the EU in this context was aimed at supporting UN OCHA in case of need. There was only, from the beginning, a very small probability that the UN could run into a situation where that might be really needed, that kind of support. And here I come back to what I said earlier. The fact that we plan for an operation where there's such a small likelihood of activation is also due to the fact that the military were not involved in the strategic planning from the very beginning. Because we could have told them, if you want to do that, which means support UN OCHA in a purely humanitarian situation where it is known that UN OCHA doesn't want to have military around unless there is already direct fire on the place, it will not happen. That was obvious. But there were many political strengths in that discussion. Another was that kind of humanitarian support would not have been necessarily the only way the EU might have supported the situation, or in the situation around Libya. You know, when you take the entire context, including NATO, you have a range from what the EU prepared, passing by a maritime observation, and coming to a no-fly zone and an enhanced no-fly zone. And one can doubt whether it is true that the EU was not able to sustain the maritime operation. But there was maybe a lack of political will to do that on the EU side. So these three examples show the broad variety of operations the EU can initiate. There is, and I think you have seen that, no template filling all situations, or fitting with all situations. But there is a real need to plan from the very beginning. I just wanted to give you one example of the comprehensive approach, and I mentioned the EU strategy on the Horn of Africa, to show that there is not only the military operation, there is very much around it. There is, to begin with, the financial support to EMISOM, which to a large extent includes the Commission. There is EUTM, the EU training mission for Somalia. There is an intended operation, well, the crisis management concept already exists, for regional maritime capacity building, which is, starting with Somalia, to provide countries in the region with their own autonomous capabilities to deal with piracy, to have coast control, coast guard-like forces. We have an overarching Horn of Africa strategy, which was created by this complicated structure. We have an increasing level of cooperation with the African Union, and we have to stay aware that the EU together, the EU itself, and accumulated with the bilateral efforts of member states, is the strongest contributor worldwide in this area. So, the lessons to draw from that in the comprehensive approach, which should bring together all these elements, plus the elements of the Commission. The military is only one player, one efficient player, but only one, which needs to remain involved at an early stage. About capabilities, I will pick only one point of that. I mentioned permanent structured cooperation, kind of stalemate. Pooling and sharing. What's the idea behind pooling and sharing? Pooling and sharing came about when it became very clear that the crisis had already triggered significant decreases in national defense budgets. So, the expectation from pooling and sharing is to create savings in a way which maintain capabilities. If you do not coordinate the reduction of armed forces, 27 individual countries will reduce where they think it's most important for them from a national point of view. The attempt, which is undertaken by pooling and sharing, is, on a voluntary basis, to coordinate these reforms, these corporations, in order to maintain crucial capabilities for the European Union's military action. It is good to do away, to give you one example, with heavy armor. Heavy armor, to a very large extent, is not needed any longer. But you cannot do away with all heavy armor you have in Europe. So you have to find those who are still able and willing to continue with that capability. And it can also be a cooperation of some countries, of a group of countries, to maintain that kind of military skills. And allow me now to come to my conclusion. I hope I made it clear that the real need for the military in this context here is to remain involved and even to be better involved than today. Earlier, with the full sight on the intentions of the European Union and with full access to all actors, particularly civilian actors. If there is a military option of whatever size, the European Union has to consider whether she can play this role under its own, the EU's own responsibility, or if the operation should be devolved to an individual member state, as was mentioned, or to another organization, which in most cases could be NATO, but it could also be the UN to some extent. Libya is an example where the EU had the possibility to make such a choice. The choice was not made in a way that rendered the EU more visible. Not really. And that's a fact linked to unanimity and to the complete voluntariness of military contributions. We have to bring together 27 different security policy cultures. And I think that's the biggest challenge we have to face in the future. And it's there where we have to continue using these instruments.